Christine, keep your hands where I can see them. Turn around for me, right now. Thank you. You're not under arrest for nothing else. Just stay calm, hands behind your back.
Don't touch
I have to cuff you, all right? Relax that arm. Christine, breathe. I can't.
The metal clicked shut with a sharp, cold sound that echoed through the quiet yard. For a second, everything was still. Then, the air was ripped apart by a sound that didn't even seem human. It was a scream so loud and so full of panic that it made the birds in the nearby trees scatter. "My wrist! My wrist!" Sheila shrieked, her body jerking as if she had been hit by a bolt of lightning. Her face, already red and messy, twisted into a mask of pure terror. She wasn't just crying, she was coming apart at the seams. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and her mouth was open so wide you could see the back of her throat as she wailed against the sky. Deputy Miller gripped her arms firmly, trying to keep her steady, but she was like a wild animal caught in a trap. She pulled and twisted, her feet scuffing the dirt as she tried to fly away from the heavy weight of the law. Every time the metal chain rattled, she let out another ear-piercing howl, claiming the world was ending right there on that patch of grass. "Sheila, stop! We're not hunting you," the officer shouted over the noise, his voice calm but stern. He had seen people get upset before, but this was different. This was a total meltdown. She wasn't listening to his words. She was trapped in her own head, convinced that the simple act of being detained was a physical attack. To anyone watching, it looked like a scene from a nightmare. A woman, caught in a place she didn't belong, reacting to a pair of handcuffs as if they were red-hot iron. The neighbors' windows remained dark, but the air felt heavy with the drama unfolding in the driveway. The high-pitched screams continued to ring out, a desperate sound of someone who had lost all control. It was the sound of a safe place disappearing forever, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a police car waiting in the shadows. The sun was bright and warm, making the yard look like a peaceful place to be. It was the kind of day where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But the silence was broken by the heavy sound of boots on the gravel. Deputy Miller walked toward the back of the property, looking at a small building that stood away from the main house. This was the art studio, a place where the owners usually spent their time making beautiful things out of clay and wood. As the officer got closer, he saw that the heavy wooden door was standing wide open. It looked strange, like an invitation to a house that didn't want any guests. Standing right there in the doorway was a woman with a shaved head. She didn't look like a thief. She didn't have a mask or a bag full of stolen tools. She just stood there, looking a bit lost in the bright light. "Ma'am, how are you doing today?" Deputy Miller asked, keeping his voice soft but careful. He stayed a few feet back, watching her hands. The woman, who we now know as Sheila, looked up. She didn't run. She didn't even look scared yet. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice sounding thin and shaky. "I was just needing a safe place." The officer tilted his head. "A safe place? You were looking for a safe place here?" Sheila nodded slowly. She looked like she hadn't slept in a long time. Her clothes were a bit dirty, and she seemed to be moving in slow motion. She explained that she had been walking for a long time and just needed a spot to sit down where the wind couldn't find her. But then, she said something that made the officer pause. "I was just going to make myself a hot dog," she whispered, as if that explained everything. "I was hungry. I just wanted a hot dog." It was a bizarre thing to say. Most people found in a building that isn't theirs talk about being confused or taking a wrong turn. They don't usually talk about wanting to cook a snack in a stranger's art studio. This was the first sign that things were not quite right. Sheila wasn't just a trespasser, she was someone who seemed to be living in a completely different world than everyone else. The officer reached for his radio, knowing that this safe place was about to become a very busy crime scene. The homeowner, a woman who looked worried and confused, stood a safe distance away from the studio door. She explained to Deputy Miller that she had come out to check on their cold tunnel when she noticed the studio door was open. Thinking her husband might have left it unlatched, she walked inside, only to find Sheila standing right there just inside the entrance. "Who are you?" the homeowner had asked, startled to find a stranger in her private workspace. Sheila hadn't tried to run or hide. Instead, she had looked at the homeowner and calmly said, "I was just going to make myself a hot dog." The request was so strange that the homeowner had to ask her to repeat it, unable to believe what she was hearing. Sheila simply asked again, "Can I have a hot dog?" Realizing something was very wrong, the homeowner told Sheila she needed to leave because it wasn't her place. As the deputy listened, the homeowner pointed out that Sheila had been upstairs and had moved things around. This was especially upsetting because the upstairs area was filled with very fragile sculptures that were part of their art business. The homeowner shook her head, telling the officer that they had never seen this woman before in their lives. She mentioned that Sheila seemed pretty incoherent and was talking about a house on a different street, but none of it made any sense. It was a strange and uncomfortable situation, and the piece of the art studio was now replaced by the crackle of the police radio as the investigation grew more serious. Deputy Miller stood in the driveway and pulled his radio from his belt. The crackle of the dispatch center filled the air as he reported what he had found. "I've got an unknown female here," he said, his eyes never leaving Sheila. "She's incoherent, has no ID, and the homeowners found her inside their studio." Back at the station, the 911 dispatchers were already busy. The call had come in as a disturbance at a private property in Fond du Lac County. The homeowners had sounded scared but certain that someone was in their building who shouldn't be there. Now, the police were trying to piece together who this woman was and how she had ended up in a detached art studio in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. As the dispatcher talked, more details came through. The report said a woman had forced her way in, claiming she just wanted a safe place to be. But the homeowners told a different story, one of moved furniture and missing privacy. The dispatchers marked the call as a criminal trespass, a serious situation that required more officers to head toward the scene. Sheila sat on a small bench nearby, her shoulders slumped. She seemed to be in her own world, muttering about being thrown out of a car and having nowhere else to go. She didn't realize that the quiet talk on the radio was the beginning of a much bigger problem. The unknown female call was moving through the system, and the clock was ticking on her safe place. The gravel crunched under the tires of the patrol car as Officer Miller pulled into the driveway. He stepped out of the vehicle and straightened his belt, his eyes immediately locking onto the small art studio. He had been told a stranger was inside, and he needed to find out who she was and why she was there. As he walked toward the building, he saw Sheila standing near the door. She looked small and tired, but there was a strange energy about her that made the officer stay alert. "Ma'am, how are you doing?" "I'm Sergeant Miller from the sheriff's office," he said, keeping his voice steady and polite. He wanted to start the conversation calmly to see how she would react. Sheila didn't try to hide. She looked at him with wide eyes and said, "Hi. I mean no harm." She seemed like she was trying to be helpful, but her words were coming out in a way that didn't quite make sense. Officer Miller asked her what was going on, and Sheila gave him a sad smile. I was just needing a safe place," she explained. She told him she had been walking from a nearby town and felt like she had no choice but to leave wherever she was before. She talked about having to pack a single bag and go, but she couldn't explain exactly where she had come from or where she was headed. The officer watched her closely as she spoke. While she seemed quiet, she couldn't give him a straight answer about her identity. When he asked for her name, she told him it was Sheila, but when he asked for her last name, she just shook her head and said, "I don't know." This was the first real sign of trouble. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple mistake. Sheila was someone who was deeply lost, both on the map and in her own mind. The red flag that had been waving in Officer Miller's mind grew even larger as the conversation continued. He asked Sheila for any kind of identification, a driver's license, a state card, or even just a piece of mail with her name on it. Sheila slowly shook her head, her movements heavy and uncertain. She reached into her small bag, but instead of a wallet, she pulled out a bottle of bug spray and a small container of hand sanitizer. "I don't have any identification," she whispered, looking down at the grass. She sounded small, like a child who had gotten lost at a grocery store, but the situation was much more serious than that. She repeated that she didn't have any food or water and just wanted to be on her way. She spoke as if she could just walk away and the whole problem would disappear. Officer Miller looked at the bag again. He knew that most people who were just passing through carried something to show who they were. The fact that she had no ID, no money, and was carrying bug spray as her main possession made it clear that she was not just a traveler. She couldn't tell him her last name or where she had slept the night before, giving him only bits and pieces of a story that didn't fit together. Every time he asked a direct question, Sheila would change the subject or say she didn't know. This lack of basic information was a major problem. In the world of police work, having no name and no ID usually meant someone was hiding something or was in a very bad state of mind. As Sheila continued to beg to be let go, Officer Miller knew he couldn't let her leave until he figured out exactly who was standing in this stranger's yard. Deputy Miller walked away from Sheila for a moment to look inside the small building. The homeowner followed him, pointing at the art pieces that filled the room. This was not a normal shed or a storage unit. It was a workspace filled with delicate things. There were tall sculptures made of thin wood and fragile clay figures sitting on shelves. Everything looked like it would break if someone just brushed against it by mistake. As the officer looked around, he noticed that things were not where they belonged. A chair had been pulled into the middle of the floor, and some of the art supplies had been moved around. It was clear that someone had been living in this small space, even if it was only for a few hours. The homeowner pointed to the stairs that led to a small loft area. She said she was too scared to go up there because she didn't know what else the stranger might have touched or moved. The feeling in the room was heavy. This was a place where someone worked hard to create things, and now it felt like that piece had been stolen. Sheila hadn't just stepped inside, she had made herself at home in a place that wasn't hers. She had treated someone's life's work like a public park. She moved stuff around, the homeowner whispered, looking at her broken privacy. I have sculptures up there that are very fragile. Seeing the mess made the situation feel much more real. It wasn't just a woman asking for a hot dog anymore. It was a person who had ignored the rules of the world and walked right into the middle of someone else's life. Officer Miller took a deep breath, knowing that the next part of his job was not going to be easy. Officer Miller continued his walk through the small studio. As he moved toward the back, he spotted something that shouldn't have been there. Sitting on a small table near a pile of art books was an open can of beer. The homeowner confirmed that it wasn't theirs, it had been brought in and opened by Sheila. It was clear she had made herself very comfortable while the owners were away. But that wasn't the only thing the officer found. As he checked the pocket of a jacket Sheila had left on a chair, his fingers felt something hard and thin. He pulled out a small glass pipe. In the world of police work, a pipe like that usually meant one thing: drug paraphernalia. It was a major discovery that changed the whole mood of the afternoon. The safe place Sheila talked about was now starting to look like a crime scene. It wasn't just about a woman who was hungry or lost anymore. The beer showed she was using the studio like her own living room, and the pipe suggested there might be illegal substances involved. Officer Miller looked back at Sheila, who was still sitting outside. The evidence was piling up, and the peaceful conversation was about to come to a very sudden end. Officer Miller stepped back out into the bright daylight, his face now more serious. The small glass pipe he had found changed everything. It was no longer just a talk about a safe place or a hungry traveler. The mood in the quiet yard shifted instantly from a simple investigation to a tense criminal scene. He walked over to where Sheila was sitting. She looked up at him, her eyes still darting around as if she were looking for a way out. The officer didn't wait any longer. He knew he had enough evidence to take her into custody for trespassing and for the items he found in her jacket. "Hey, can you just put your hands behind your back, please?" Officer Miller said. His voice was firm, and he moved into a position to grab her wrists. Sheila froze for a split second, then her eyes went wide. "Really?" she asked, her voice cracking. She started to pull away, her shoulders tensing up as she tried to twist out of his reach. "Yep." "Yep," the officer replied, not letting go. He worked quickly to bring her arms together, but Sheila began to fight back. The peaceful afternoon was officially over. The safe place she had talked about was gone, and the heavy click of the handcuffs was the only sound that mattered now. The friendly conversation had turned into a battle of wills, and Sheila was starting to realize that she wasn't going to just get going on her way. The air in the driveway suddenly felt very tight. As soon as the metal cuffs touched her skin, Sheila's body went stiff, as if she had been shocked. She didn't just pull away, she began to shake and twist her torso with a sudden, frantic energy. "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything wrong," she yelled, her voice getting louder and sharper with every second. She looked around at the trees and the studio as if she were seeing them for the first time, her eyes wide and full of panic. Officer Miller kept a firm grip on her arms, trying to keep her from falling over or hurting herself. "Stop pulling, Sheila. What are you doing?" he asked, his voice staying calm even as she struggled harder. He explained that she was being detained so they could figure out what was happening, but Sheila wasn't listening to reason anymore. She kept crying out that she was just hungry and that she was only trying to get to an art class. To her, the handcuffs weren't just a way for the police to hold her, they were a sign that her safe place had completely turned into a trap. The more the officer tried to settle her down, the more she fought, her screams beginning to echo off the walls of the studio where she had just been looking for a snack. The quiet investigation was gone, replaced by a full meltdown that was only just beginning. "My wrists! My wrists are getting broken." Sheila's voice went from a scream to a sharp shriek that could be heard all the way at the road. Her body was shaking, and she kept trying to pull her arms away as the metal handcuffs stayed tight around her wrists. To her, it felt like the world was pushing down on her, even though the officer was just trying to hold her still. Deputy Miller tried to calm her down, telling her to just stop pulling so the cuffs wouldn't hurt. "Your wrists are not breaking," he said over and over, his voice deep and steady. He even offered to take a look at them to show her they were okay, but Sheila was too far gone in her panic to listen. She kept gasping for air and crying out, convinced that she was being hurt on purpose. The officer knew that the more she fought, the more it would hurt, but Sheila couldn't see that. She was trapped in a cycle of fear. She was so focused on the feeling of the metal on her skin that she forgot everything else. The yard, which had been so quiet just a few minutes ago, was now filled with the sound of her struggle. It was a sad and loud battle, and the officer knew he had to get her to the car before things got even worse. As the shouting got louder, Sheila's legs seemed to lose all their strength. It was as if she had suddenly turned into a heavy bag of sand. She sank toward the grass, her knees hitting the dirt with a soft thud. Even though the officers were trying to help her stand, she let her body go completely limp, refusing to move another inch on her own feet. "Can you please just walk?" Deputy Miller asked, his hands still holding her arms to keep her steady. He wasn't being mean, he was just trying to get her to the police car so they could finish their work. But Sheila just shook her head, her face wet with tears. "I can't. I just pissed myself," she cried out, her voice full of shame and fear. She stayed curled up on the ground, making it very hard for the officers to move her. It was a standoff in the middle of the backyard. Sheila had decided that if she couldn't have her safe place, she wasn't going to go anywhere else at all. The officers stood over her, looking down at the woman who had just wanted a hot dog. They knew they couldn't just leave her there, but moving someone who won't help themselves is very difficult. The yard was quiet except for Sheila's heavy breathing and the distant sound of a car passing by on the road. The meltdown had reached a point where Sheila had simply given up, leaving the officers to figure out how to finish the arrest without hurting her further. As Sheila sat on the damp grass, the reality of the situation began to sink in, but not in a way that helped her calm down. Instead, her mind seemed to move toward a darker place. Officer Miller and his partner stood on either side of her, their shadows long against the art studio wall. They were trying to be patient, but the clock was ticking, and they still had a job to finish. "Sheila, listen to me," Officer Miller said, bending down so he was at her level. "This is just going to get you into more trouble than what you need. If you just stand up and walk to the car, it will be over much faster." He spoke slowly, using the kind of voice one might use with a scared child, but the warning was clear. Every second she spent fighting or acting like she couldn't move was another second added to her charges for resisting an officer. But Sheila didn't seem to care about the warning. Her eyes were glazed over, and she started muttering things that made no sense. She looked up at Officer Miller and, in the middle of her tears, said something completely out of left field. I want a sexy police officer," she whispered, her voice shaking with a strange, nervous energy. The officers shared a quick, tired look. They knew this was a sign that her behavior was becoming even more erratic. She wasn't just scared anymore, she was losing her grip on what was actually happening. The warning hadn't worked because Sheila wasn't in a place where she could think about the future. To her, the only thing that existed was the grass beneath her, the metal on her wrists, and the strange, confusing thoughts swirling in her head. The standoff continued, the air heavy with the feeling that the biggest explosion was still yet to come. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to a terrifying new peak. As the officers tried to lift her from the grass, Sheila's body began to convulse with a new wave of panic. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she began to gasp for air as if the very oxygen in the yard had vanished. The irrational fear that had been bubbling under the surface finally exploded into a single, desperate thought that she couldn't stop repeating. "I'm dying. I'm dying," she wailed, her voice cracking under the strain. She wasn't just saying it to be difficult. In her distorted state of mind, she truly believed her life was slipping away right there in the backyard. She claimed she couldn't feel her legs and that the world was going dark, even though the sun was still shining brightly above them. Officer Miller kept a steady hand on her shoulder, trying to ground her in reality. "You're not dying, Sheila. You're okay," he told her firmly, but his words couldn't reach her. She was trapped in the climax of her meltdown, convinced that the arrest was a death sentence. Every attempt to move her toward the waiting squad car resulted in more screams and more claims that her heart was stopping. The homeowners watched from their porch, silent and stunned. What had started as a strange encounter over a hot dog had turned into a full-blown psychological crisis. Sheila's transition from a quiet trespasser to a woman convinced she was taking her last breaths was the final, tragic peak of the afternoon's chaos. It took the combined strength of the officers to finally guide her toward the car, while her cries of "I'm dying" continued to ring out through the neighborhood. With Sheila finally secured near the vehicle, the officers had to ensure she wasn't carrying anything that could hurt her or them. While she continued to sob and mutter about her life ending, Officer Miller began a systematic search of her pockets and her bag. He moved carefully, asking her directly if she had any needles or knives that might poke him. Inside her jacket and bag, the mystery of her behavior started to make more sense. Along with the glass pipe found earlier, the officers discovered a green, leafy substance. This material was later tested and confirmed to be THC. It wasn't just a safe place or a hot dog that had brought Sheila here, she was under the influence of substances that had twisted her view of the world. As the officer pulled items out, Sheila's focus shifted randomly. She pointed to a piece of string and claimed it was for her daughter, though she couldn't explain why she had it or where her daughter was. Every piece of evidence, the beer, the pipe, and the drugs, painted a picture of a woman who had lost her way long before she stepped into the art studio. The search was the final piece of the puzzle, proving that the meltdown wasn't just about the handcuffs, but about the chemicals in her system. The heavy door of the squad car clicked shut, finally cutting off the sound of Sheila's screams. After the loud chaos in the yard, the silence inside the car felt heavy and strange. Deputy Miller climbed into the driver's seat and adjusted his mirror. Behind the plastic partition, Sheila was slumped against the seat, her face red and tired from all the crying. She wasn't fighting anymore. The energy she had used to scream about her wrists and her fear of dying had completely run out. She sat in the back of the car as it pulled away from the quiet neighborhood and the art studio she had tried to make her home for the day. As they drove toward the Fond du Lac County Jail, she went back to being the quiet, incoherent woman the homeowners had first found. Once they arrived at the jail, the process was slow and quiet. Sheila was booked into custody, her name finally recorded in the system along with the list of things she had done wrong. She was charged with several things: trespassing in someone's house, resisting the officers, jumping bail, and having drugs and pipes in her pockets. In the end, the big meltdown didn't change the facts. A few months later, the court made its final decision. Most of the smaller charges were dropped, but Sheila had to admit she was wrong about the drugs. She was convicted of attempted possession of THC and had to pay $443 in court costs. The story that started with a bizarre request for a hot dog ended in a cold courtroom, with Sheila left to figure out a new path forward far away from the safe place she had tried to take for herself. The ride to the Fond du Lac County Jail was a stark contrast to the explosive scene in the driveway. Inside the squad car, the air was thick and quiet, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Sheila sat in the back, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window. The woman who had just been screaming that she was dying was now completely silent, her energy spent. At the jail, the booking process was slow and methodical. Deputies processed Sheila's paperwork, documenting the events that had transpired at the art studio. The initial list of charges was long and serious. She was officially booked for multiple misdemeanor offenses: criminal trespass to a dwelling for entering the studio, resisting or obstructing an officer for her physical struggle, misdemeanor bail jumping, and disorderly conduct for her disruptive behavior. Additionally, she faced drug-related violations for the pipe and the THC found in her possession. For Sheila, the safe place she had been searching for had turned into a cinder-block cell. The confusion of the afternoon began to fade into the cold reality of the legal system. There were no hot dogs here, and no art sculptures, only the harsh lights of the intake center and the heavy weight of her own choices. As the weeks passed, the legal gears began to turn. The chaotic scene captured on the body cam was reviewed by lawyers and a judge to decide Sheila's fate. While the initial list of charges had been long, the court process often leads to negotiations and changes. During the court proceedings, most of the counts against her, including the trespassing and the resisting arrest, were eventually dismissed. However, the physical evidence of the drugs was harder to ignore. Sheila ultimately decided not to fight the final charge. She entered a no contest plea to the charge of attempted possession of THC. The judge handed down the sentence, a formal conviction on her record and a requirement to pay $443 in court costs. Along with the fine, the court ordered additional conditions to ensure she stayed on the right track. The woman who had caused a neighborhood scandal over a hot dog was now just a name on a file, paying off a debt to a system she had tried so hard to fight. With the court case closed, the quiet returned to the Fond du Lac neighborhood. The homeowners eventually repaired the sense of peace that had been broken that Saturday afternoon. The art studio was locked tight, its fragile sculptures safe once again from uninvited guests. The story of the woman who had a full meltdown over a hot dog became a cautionary tale. It served as a reminder of how quickly a small, strange moment can spiral into a life-changing event when drugs and mental distress are involved. For the officers involved, it was another day on the job, but for Sheila, it was the end of a very long and painful road. In the final look at the case, the transformation was complete. Sheila had moved from a stranger in a studio to a person with a legal conviction.